Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Usually we look at events overseas, U.S. actions in other countries. But this week, a number of events in Washington have drawn attention to the shaping of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. regularly ignores international law, blatantly rejects the idea that other nations have or should have sovereignty over their own affairs, and engages in sanctions and regime change operations against nations that quite obviously pose no threat to the United States. These belligerent and illegal actions are justified to the American people as our role as the exceptional nation, the beacon of freedom and democracy to the world, or as necessary to counter the efforts of our self-described enemies. Two women in the U.S. Congress have recently brought this rationale for U.S. foreign policy into question, and in doing so, illuminated both the sinister and counterproductive nature of that policy and the forces that support it. Let's begin with Ilhan Abdullahi Omar, the Somali-American woman elected to represent the 5th District of Minnesota last fall. Ms. Omar won with 78% of the vote, becoming the first Somali-American elected to the U.S. Congress, the first woman of color to serve as a U.S. representative from Minnesota, and alongside Michigan's Rashida Tlaib, one of the first Muslim women elected to the U.S. Congress. You would think the Democratic Party leadership would be overjoyed that a female of color and a Muslim was joining their ranks and giving credence to their claim to diversity. But the events of last week or so would prove otherwise. Here's Amy Goodman talking with Glenn Greenwald on February 11th about the tweet storm that has caused so much controversy.
On Sunday, you tweeted, quote, GOP leader Kevin McCarthy threatens punishment for Ilhan MN, Ilhan, Minnesota, and Rashida Tlaib over their criticisms of Israel. It's stunning how much time U.S. political leaders spend defending a foreign nation, even if it means attacking free speech rights of Americans, you wrote. Well, Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota retweeted your post and added the line, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." Then an opinion editor from the Forward newspaper tweeted, "Would love to know who Ilhan thinks is paying American politicians to be pro-Israel, though I think I can guess. Bad form, Congresswoman. That's the second anti-Semitic trope you've tweeted." Ilhan Omar then responded to that tweet by writing, AIPAC. Democratic Congressman Max Rose responded to Omar by saying, Congresswoman Omar's statements are deeply hurtful to Jews, including myself. So, Glenn, can you respond to all of this?
This is all so ridiculous. It's all based upon this demand that we indulge what everybody knows is an utter and complete fiction, which is that we're allowed to talk about the power of the NRA in Washington. We're allowed to talk about the power of the Saudis in Washington. We're allowed to talk about the power of big pharmaceutical companies and Wall Street and Silicon Valley and the fossil fuel industry in Washington. But we're not allowed to talk about an equally potent, well-organized, and well-financed lobby that ensures a bipartisan consensus in support of U.S. Defense of Israel. That the minute that you mention that lobby, you get attacked as being anti-Semitic, which is what happened to Congresswoman Omar. And I think the context here is really important. For a long time, the bipartisan piety was not just that the U.S. has to support Israel, but that in particular, the effort to boycott Israel in protest of its occupation of Palestine is not just misguided, but anti-Semitic. That's the official position of the Democratic Party, of Hillary Clinton, of Chuck Schumer, of every leading Democrat. And now suddenly you have these two really exciting, dynamic, charismatic women of color newly elected to Congress, the first two Muslim women elected to Congress, who both are supporters of the boycott of Israel, which the Democratic Party says is bigotry and anti-Semitism. And it's created this very awkward moment. So of course, the minute two Muslim women arrive in Congress, they're going to get attacked as anti-Semitic if they're critical of Israel, which they are, just like Keith Ellison, the first Muslim ever elected to Congress, got vilified as being an anti-Semite by Chaim Sabin, the billionaire funder of the Democratic Party, when he tried to be the chairman of the DNC. What the Congresswoman said is very uncontroversial. Everyone knows AIPAC is an extremely intimidating lobby, just like the NRA is. There's nothing wrong with pointing that out. There's certainly nothing anti-Semitic about saying that, about criticizing the Israeli government for its aggression and militarism. And anybody who cares about Palestinians and about the ability of Muslims in the United States to be able to speak freely ought to be defending her.
As Greenwald points out, it's self-evident that the Israel lobby and AIPAC in particular have a strong influence over Congress. In fact, the number of pro-Palestinian members of Congress can be counted on the fingers of one hand and are generally first-termers. The number of members of Congress who will call out the pernicious influence of the Israel lobby on U.S. politics is even smaller. The reason is fear. And yes, Representative Omar, it is all about the money. Here's Ariel Gold, the national co-director of Code Pink, and she spoke recently with Sonali Kolhatkar on Rising Up with Sonali about Omar's tweet and the role of AIPAC.
Ilhan Omar pointed out what is a well-known and not so hidden fact on Capitol Hill, that AIPAC is ruthless and uses all kinds of means, including financial means, to ensure that Congress does their bidding. I think we all remember Cynthia McKinney, who dared to challenge AIPAC's positions. And AIPAC saw that in her reelection campaign that her opponent was bankrolled. So AIPAC itself does not make these campaign contributions, but they direct their members to do so. And it absolutely turns out that money drives this. It's money, it's politics, and AIPAC is one of the strongest lobbies in the U.S. They demand unconditional U.S. support for Israel, increasing amounts of U.S. military aid. Right now, Israel gets $3.8 billion. That's a whole lot of Benjamins. So to say that she was off base, or this didn't have to do with money, or that she was intending anything anti-Semitic is an outright smear campaign. And what it serves to do is distract the public and distract our lawmakers from the real conversations that we need to be having, the conversations about the ongoing denial of Palestinian rights, endless U.S. support for a country with numerous human rights abuses, including the killing of over 200 Palestinians in Gaza since since the end of March last year.
Nothing demonstrates the power of AIPAC and the veracity of Congresswoman Omar's comments better than Senate Resolution 1, the very first bill taken up by the United States Senate this term. Here's Glenn Greenwald.
The very first bill passed by the U.S. Senate was not about helping Americans. It was about empowering states to punish people who support a boycott of Israel, a bill sponsored by Marco Rubio, who got more money from Sheldon Adelson than any other politician in 2016, and then was supported by half of the Democratic Senate caucus. That's what I was referring to. And the Congresswoman was saying a big reason for that is the moneyed interest in Washington that demand that. And of course, everyone knows that's true. And to call that anti-Semitic is just obscene.
As Sonali Kolhatkar and Ariel Gold point out, the Israel lobby directs the policy of both political parties.
Any attempt to smear the leaders in Congress, like Ilhan Omar, who are progressive on so many issues, who have pried open this question of criticizing Israel. Ilhan Omar is also one of the leaders in working to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war on Yemen. She's one of the few members of Congress who's been brave enough to speak out against a U.S. orchestrated coup in Venezuela. So these are forces of establishment, forces of the status quo, and Israeli occupation apologists who are looking for excuses to find false accusations of anti-Semitism so that they can bring down one of the real front runners in moving our policy towards more progressive positions.
Let's talk about how AIPAC does influence members of both parties and how leader Nancy Pelosi was among the ones that basically shut her down.
Well, this was really despicable of Pelosi. We're talking about the same woman who just, I believe it was last Friday, just followed Donald Trump in recognizing Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. So this is somebody who just took a war hawk position. And I think Pelosi might be intimidated by all of these rising progressive stars. And absolutely, you know, AIPAC has for so long had a stranglehold on Congress. And we've seen that grip that AIPAC has on Congress slipping in the past years. So this was a real attempt to reassert that the Democratic Party will not move towards a position of working for Palestinian rights. And that's horrific.
AIPAC sponsors trips for members of Congress to Israel, right?
Absolutely. And this year, for the first time, we've seen Rashida Tlaib say she'll be rejecting the trip and that she'll be leading a trip of her own. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has also said that she will be skipping the AIPAC trip. And we've seen a lot of backlash against Rashida Tlaib for this, for saying that she wants people not to go on a propaganda trip and that she would like to offer members of Congress an opportunity to see the reality of the situation on the ground that Palestinians live under, the occupation. You know, we've seen members of Congress now trying to block her trip. And so there have been a series of attacks on both Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. And what I would say happened this time with this tweet is these occupation apologists really seized on this moment to launch a full-scale attack.
It's not just Israel policy that makes Ilhan Omar a target of both the Republican and Democratic Party. She is also a forceful spokesperson against U.S. foreign policy. Earlier this week, in a House Foreign Affairs Committee open hearing, Representative Omar questioned Elliott Abrams, recently appointed by President Trump to be his special envoy on Venezuela. It should be noted that Abrams also helped organize the covert financing of Contra rebels in Nicaragua behind the back of Congress, which had cut off funding. He then lied to Congress about his role twice. Abrams was an enthusiastic advocate of the Iraq invasion and was in the White House at the time of the abortive coup in 2002 against Hugo Chavez and reportedly gave the green light to the coup. Here's the exchange between Ilhan Omar and war criminal Elliott Abrams.
In 1991, you pleaded guilty to 2 counts of withholding information from Congress regarding your involvement in the Iran-Contra affair, for which you were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. I fail to understand why members of this committee or the American people should find any testimony that you give today to be truthful.
If I can respond to that.
It wasn't a question. On February, that was not a question. That was I reserve the right to my time.
It is not right.
That was not a question.
Committee can attack
on February 8th,
who is not permitted to reply.
That was not a question. Thank you for your participation. On February 8th, 1982, you testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about U.S. policy in El Salvador. In that hearing, you dismissed as communist propaganda report about the massacre of El Mozote, in which more than 800 civilians, including children as young as 2 years old, were brutally murdered by U.S.-trained troops. During that massacre, some of those troops bragged about raping a 12-year-old girl before they killed them. You later said that the U.S. policy in El Salvador was a fabulous achievement. Yes or no, do you still think so?
From the day that President Duarte was elected in a free election to this day, El Salvador has been a democracy. That's a fabulous achievement.
Well, we have to stop it right there because, as The Intercept reports, Abrams' words were not only factually demonstrably untrue, but grossly so, according to Alejandro Velasco, a professor of modern Latin American history at NYU. Jose Napoleon Duarte was elected president of El Salvador in 1984, but it was not a free election. All of the parties that were to the left of his party were systematically prevented from participating due to right-wing death squads that would have killed anyone coming to the polls to vote for them. And Duarte was given between $1 and $3 million for his campaign by the CIA so that he would beat Robert d'Aubisson, widely known to be leader of many death squads. And El Salvador has also not been a democracy since 1984. Control of the country has been in the hands of the military, and according to the United Nations and other supporters of human rights, the elections have substantial irregularities that prevent them from being either free or fair. But let's continue now with the hearing.
Yes or no, do you think that massacre was a fabulous achievement that happened under our watch?
That is a ridiculous question, and
yes or no?
No.
I will take that as a yes.
I am not going to respond to that kind of personal attack, which is not a question.
Yes or no, would you support an armed faction within Venezuela that engages in war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide, if you believe they were serving U.S. interest, as you did in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua?
I am not going to respond to that question. I'm sorry. I don't think this entire line of questioning is meant to be real questions, and so I will not reply.
Whether under your watch, a genocide will take place, and you will look the other way because American interests were being upheld, is a fair question, because the American people want to know that anytime we engage a country, that we think about what our actions could be and how we believe our values are being furthered. That is my question. Will you make sure that human rights are not violated and that we uphold international and human rights?
I suppose there is a question in there, and the answer is that the entire thrust of American policy in Venezuela is to support the Venezuelan people's effort to restore democracy to their country. That's our policy.
Well, if you believe that's our policy in Venezuela, I have a bridge to sell you. You know, questions like those Ms. Omar asked should be standard fare in meetings of the Foreign Affairs Committees of both houses of Congress. Our representatives should be challenging administrations of both parties when they lie to us about war, when they appoint known war criminals to important positions in the government. When you hear calls for her to be removed from the prestigious Foreign Affairs Committee, it's because this young Muslim woman new to the Washington scene has the courage to tell the truth about U.S. foreign policy. That cannot be tolerated. When we come back, another congressional female makes waves. You're listening to Wider View, a weekly conversation with analysts and activists rarely found in the mainstream media. Wider View is made available free of charge to radio stations nationwide, and a podcast of this show is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play Music as Wider View Radio, and at widerviewradio.podbean.com. You can also follow us on Facebook at Wider View Radio. In 2012, the people of Hawaii's 2nd District elected a new representative in Congress who became the first Hindu and the first Samoan American elected to that body. Earlier this year, she launched her bid to become the Democratic nominee for president in 2020. Here's an excerpt from the speech at her launch event in Honolulu.
We must stand up against this administration that claims to believe in America first, but who sells our troops, our weapons, and our interests to whichever foreign country is the highest bidder. We must stand up against those who dishonor our troops, treating them as political pawns and mercenaries for hire in wars around the world. We must stand up against powerful politicians from both parties who sit in their ivory towers, thinking up new wars to wage, new places for people to die, wasting trillions of our taxpayer dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives, and undermining our economy and our security and destroying our middle class. Now, President Trump campaigned against regime change wars when he ran for president, but now he bows to the wishes of the neocons who surround him, clamoring for regime change wars that he claimed to oppose, this time in Venezuela and in Iran. These powerful politicians dishonor the sacrifices made by every one of my brothers and sisters in uniform, their families, as they are the ones who pay the price for these wars. In fact, every American pays the price for these wars that have cost us trillions of dollars since 9/11. Every dollar that we spend on regime change wars or on the new Cold War and this nuclear arms race is a dollar coming out of our pockets. Dollars that should be used to address the very real urgent needs of our people and our communities right here at home. We must stand united and stand strong against those in both parties who never tire of war. Neocons and neolibs who drag us from one regime change war to the next and who are exacerbating the new Cold War, pushing us to the brink of nuclear war. We deserve better. Our country deserves better.
Now, I'm not endorsing Tulsi Gabbard's candidacy. It's far too early for that. But how long has it been since we heard a candidate for president saying things like this? How long since we had a candidate who was willing to challenge the Washington establishment on their love of war? Writing about her candidacy, the Saker wrote, and I quote, "One of two things is most likely to happen next. Tulsi Gabbard remains true to her ideals and views, and she gets no money for her campaign. Or Tulsi Gabbard caves in to the neocons and the deep state, and she becomes another Obama or Trump. Okay, in theory, a third option is possible, never say never, but I see that as highly unlikely. Tulsi Gabbard follows in the footsteps of Trump and gets elected in spite of a massive media hate campaign against her, and once she makes it to the White House, she does what Trump failed to do and appeals directly to the people of the USA to back her in a ruthless campaign to drain the swamp, meaning showing the door to the neocons and their deep state." End quote. Saker goes on to say, quote, "The most important achievement of Tulsi Gabbard, at least so far, has been to prove that the so-called liberals don't give a damn about race, don't give a damn about gender, don't give a damn about minorities, don't give a damn about thanking our veterans or anything else. They don't even care about Israel all that much, but what they do care about is power, empire, and war. That they really care about." Tulsi Gabbard is a living proof that the U.S. Democrats and other pretend liberals are hell-bent on power, empire, and war. They will also stop at nothing to prevent the USA from finally becoming a normal country, and they couldn't care less about the fate of the people of the USA. All they want is for us all to become their serfs. End quote. The decision about whether to believe Tulsi is the real thing will become clear over the next few months. The best indicator we will have is her treatment by, or absence from, the mainstream media. What we're seeing recently are appearances where she is either grilled over and over about her anti-war stance, particularly in regard to Syria, or discussions of potential candidates that omit her from consideration. Both are indications that she's a serious contender. Search the MSNBC or CNN websites for stories about her and you'll see what I mean. As Caitlin Johnstone wrote recently, quote, "We can expect to see a whole lot more of this as the plutocratic media works overtime to undermine Gabbard's message in order to keep her from disrupting establishment war narratives. Military interventionism is by far the most depraved and destructive aspect of the U.S. centralized power establishment, and it's also the most lucrative and strategically crucial, which is why so much energy is poured into ensuring that the American people don't use the power of their numbers to force that interventionism to end. Anyone who throws a monkey wrench in the works of this propaganda machine is going to be subjected to a tremendous amount of smears, and I'm glad to see Gabbard fighting back against those smears." End quote. One of the recent smears was by NBC News, which published a piece claiming that experts have scientific proof that an army of suspected Russian accounts and Kremlin-linked websites are propelling Gabbard's campaign. But their scientific backing came from a firm called New Knowledge that was implicated in fraud and election meddling in the recent Alabama Senate race. In that race, they fabricated Russian troll accounts in order to manufacture false accusations that the Kremlin was interfering in that election, and they're doing the same thing here. We need to keep our eye on Tulsi Gabbard's campaign over the next few months. Will she be permitted to participate in the primary debates, which unbelievably begin in June of this year? Will she be permitted to bring her anti-war message to the American people, or will they find a way to stifle her like they stifled Dennis Kucinich in the past? This program will work to bring you all the voices that oppose wars of choice, all the voices that oppose U.S. intervention in the affairs of other sovereign nations, all the voices that threaten to reduce our military spending in order to fund human needs. I hope other candidates join Tulsi Gabbard in advocating peace, and that other Congress members join Ilhan Omar in calling out the warmongers and war criminals who still roam free in Washington. It's truly exciting to see that the identity politics of the Democratic Party are backfiring on the very establishment politicians that have trumpeted those values while ignoring the war machine, the war crimes of Israel and Saudi Arabia, and the rise in inequality here at home. They got their women of color elected, they got their diversity, and now they need to listen to what those women are saying. That's going to be a tougher sell. Well, that's our show for this week. If you have comments or questions about what you've heard, email me at widerviewradio@gmail.com or leave a comment on our Facebook page at Widerview Radio. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.